So hey all, we're gonna have a conversation here. I'm Zach Loeks and this is Michael Tice. And we are going to look at water catchment in an urban permaculture homestead. And this is a great property, there's a lot going on. I'm a fan favorite. But I really like looking at this from the point of view of how the water falls. So when water hits your roof, what happens?
So the water lands on the roof, and we can think of that as the top of our little watershed here. And then it comes down the roof, and then we've attached a piece of downspout to the roof so that it goes over top of this arbor. That arbor is growing some kiwis. You can see somebody standing here playing with the kiwis. And so then the water comes down that downspout and goes into these large tanks that we put on the side. So we started with just one rain barrel, then we added another, and then another. And then we added these larger tanks. They have a very small footprint because we just have a small space to work with here between our house and the neighbors, but they're very tall. So each of these tanks holds about 680 liters.
Yeah, and they are a narrow tank, and that's something to really point out, that as you're scaling up your water design for an urban homestead, you may want to take the next leap from a water barrel, or even sometimes people have on a pallet, these tanks on a pallet, but they take up a big footprint. And this is really nice to put along the edge of a building or along a fence line because it goes up. And you're also going to increase your height above the elevation of your garden, so you're actually going to end up getting more pressure. So the first part of this design is that the roof itself is capturing, and then the eaves trough is collecting, and then it's transporting along. In this case, very clever to put it around with this arbor, making a nice little walkway here, and using the fence line of the property to house the tanks. And so then the tanks become the source of water for the irrigation system. So what's the next step? What happens after these tanks?
So yeah, so the tanks start to fill up with the water. They have a pipe between them that they'll both fill at the same time. Once the tanks get totally full, then there's an overflow at the top that just naturally by gravity, once the water reaches that level, then it starts to flow down that pipe, and it comes out of that pipe, and then we've buried that pipe in the ground until it goes into the walkways, which are sort of interwoven in between these different planting areas here.
So this is a very cool part of the design, and it's important to think about it in terms of its own permaculture design because it has a lot of aspects to it. But in terms of the water management, because of these sunken paths, the overflow always has a place to go. You're never going to end up with water, flooding across your yard, things like that. So tell us a little bit more about, in detail here, our cross section. What is this path? What's happening here in terms of its structure?
So when we built these paths, what we did was we designed it all out, and then we dug a 2-foot deep trench. It doesn't have to be that deep, but we were young and inexperienced, and so we took it to the absolute max.
Always.
And
Farm engineering, we call that, right?
Sure. And then we filled the bottom of the trench with some logs and brush and basically anything we could find that would break down eventually. We took some scrap wood and built a walkway on top of that, and then put wood chips on top of the scrap wood boardwalk, and then inoculated those wood chips with edible mushrooms. So then, just to go back to the water, it comes down, and we've got sort of a cross-section view here. So then the water fills up the trench, and slowly percolates and flows through all these various arms of the trenches. But if the water should ever be such a volume of water in such a short period of time that the capacity of the trench to hold it was overwhelmed, rather than having it haphazardly overflow into any particular area, especially we don't want that going back towards the house, right? What we did was we created the lowest spot in the system as a whole was right here at the sidewalk. So in well over 10 years, this has only overflowed a small handful of times. And it just basically weeps, or it wicks. It seeps out of the system onto the sidewalk, and then it goes into the boulevard and soaks in there yet too before it finally makes its way to the street.
Right, so you got a little bit of a check dam at the end just to keep as much back as possible, and then it lets it out. But honestly, your yard has been designed to really absorb water. I do want to talk about that a little bit because we've talked about the water catchment and the irrigation capacity, and obviously here we have a guy over here watering in the garden, and that is part of the beauty of having water stored, is that you can use it for irrigation. And there is enough pressure here because you have, of course, these water tanks are tall and you have all this water coming off the roof here. And at the end of the day, that is a great way of creating irrigation power from, you know, your overall precipitation in your overall region. But what about the fact that before you even have to pick up that hose, you've already created irrigation from the capacity of your ecosystem to hold moisture in the soil. So let's talk a little bit about that before we jump over here.
Yeah, and that's really, we're trying to replicate the forest. Is that who waters the forest, right? You know,
It's not the elves.
right?
And
and yet it takes a lot for the forest to dry out. And so the same, we've eventually, through the years of building up our soil with as much organic matter as possible, and mulch and ground covers, and then the various layers that make up our perennial systems, you know, shading it and everything like that. We very rarely, most years, we don't have to water this entire area. It's a self-watering garden.
that's really interesting. And it also helps us close the loop of the hydrological cycle. If we have condensation in the atmosphere and precipitation, then we have flow, and then we have storage like you would have in a pond or a lake. And then here you also have storage in the soil. All the openings, the porosity in the soil has a capacity to hold water. The extra organic matter that's being placed in here, as well as literally you could think of this as a very large macropore actually built into these trench pathways. But then the ground cover itself is then also reducing evaporation. So we're actually holding as much of it stored instead of allowing it to easily evaporate away. The opposite, I think, is true for almost all of our urban, suburban, and rural landscapes. The water falls, it quickly runs off. The capacity of the soil to absorb that water, the capacity of the soil to store that water is not available, and so it runs off, it causes erosion, and we lose that moisture. Whereas here it's being caught, it's being collected, it's being stored, and the evaporation and loss is being reduced. And even here, very minimal losses. Again, you said, I think, 2 times, is that it?
Something like that
And it was like a big, wet year, right?
Yes, yeah.
So you're getting to keep a lot of your water. So now let's go over here. I want to talk a little bit about how you've placed your water catchment. I know that we have not a full picture of your entire property. So how many collection points do you actually have?
At each of the downspouts. So we have 4 on the house, and then there's 1 on the little added-on sunroom at the back, and there's 2 garden sheds in the back, and we collect the water off of those as well. And then even our neighbor's shed, he was having trouble with flooding in his yard. It's a low spot. And so he was happy to let us put an eaves trough on his shed and then take that as well and collect that.
That's cool.
So, yeah.
Good water catchment makes good neighbors.
Right, yeah. It was a win-win situation.
Win-win. And then if we look at this, we've actually outlined here that overall the catchment that's happening on this side of the house and that's happening on this side of the house is actually managing these 2 sections fairly well in terms of your hose. You want to tell us a little more about how you actually water and use the water from this side and this side?
So yeah, so like you were saying, Zach, with these tanks, we get an increase in pressure by the taller tank. But even with that, you know, or let's say you're down to the last bit of it, there is going to be a certain point where you're not going to want to stand there. Water is still coming out of the hose, but you don't want to stand there for that long. It's not that efficient. And so we have sort of a length of hose off of each tank that we've figured out it works for the tanks. Right. And so we can think of these yellow circles as the distance that hose will cover. And you see that they actually overlap a little bit. But between the 2 tanks, then it covers each of these zones. And we could do that, like we were saying just a second ago, with each of those other downspout areas. They have tanks with hoses, and so almost the entire property is covered by hoses, so that makes watering a lot happier of an activity.
Yeah, so if you imagine the property as a bird's eye view, you can imagine these circles, these spheres of water influence kind of radiating out from the downspouts and the tanks, and overall that creates complete coverage for when you do need to irrigate. Now, we have said that over here, for the most part, these ecosystems in here are thriving because they're perennial-based gardens, so they're not needing a lot of moisture. You've built up the capacity of the soil to hold moisture in the soil. So what type of plantings are you focusing your irrigation on?
Is our, let's call this the driveway here, and then we have a bunch of pots along the side. And so obviously they're much less resilient if it doesn't rain consistently. And so it's often those pots that we'll use the hoses for, or out back in the annual veggie garden, then in raised beds. Then they also have a tendency to be a little more sensitive. The root systems aren't as deep and everything like that. And so then we'll use the hoses with them as well. But generally our tanks are, even if we experience a pretty extended period without rain, like talking weeks without rain, we'll still have water in the tanks because we mulch our annual systems, and so we collect, we really optimize the use of the water that we do have access to, both in terms of how we harvest it and store it, but then also in the efficiency of using it.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you got to keep that conservation all around. Certainly vegetables, just to tie back, require water in a little different manner. And I think it's important to note that for germination of vegetables, you need moisture. So even if it's a wet year, if you want to keep your successions of your plantings of lettuce and things on schedule, you need to apply moisture. So even if you're living in a climate where you have really good precipitation, you may want to have water catchment to help you, A, deal with excess water, help direct it where you want it, but also just to help stimulate and germinate your annuals. In this case, also your potted culture here is something that was really benefiting from that. And then I would say, what happens here in a drought? You have a little less rainfall coming in, but you still can hold it over from the rain events that do occur. And then is that a time when you really start to think you want to place water in here? Or are you still finding that this design in a drought, clearly it's going to be better off, but do you add to it in that case?
I mean, there has been times where we haven't had rain for 2 calendar months, and you can see that the plants are suffering. And honestly, I think that given the system that we've facilitated here, the plants would still make their way through, but we didn't want to chance it. And so it's like, okay, well, we could either have a bunch of our plants die potentially and really test our system here, or we could just put the sprinkler on and actually add some city water. And so we've done that a handful of times, but in let's say 12 years, that's been a handful of times. And one of the really neat things I think about this water battery, where it's like a giant sponge in this area, is that in the fall time, if the tanks are still full of water and the freeze is going to come, we can't let the water freeze in the tanks. We don't have to lose that water. We can actually still add it into the system just by draining the tanks into the pathways. And the same thing with shoveling the snow in the winter. Is that it actually becomes a fun activity that
you're watering the garden in the winter,
right, in February. And let's say the sidewalk is here. I'll shovel the snow up onto the plantings, and it makes me happy to think that every shovel full of snow is more water that's going to soak in, and so we keep all of the spring melt water in the system as well.
Yeah, so we think the same way. So on the homestead, I snow blow into the swale beside the berm where my linear food forest is, and it's winter watering. It's accumulating there. So that's great. I mean, that brings it kind of full cycle in the sense that you're talking about, well, even in the driest periods, you may tap into the city water a little bit, which reminds us how much city water you're not using, because your entire property is green and growing and yielding food, and yet you are making use of the roof. And I do want to point out there is some infrastructure, but this is pretty low tech. And that is, of course, a really good sign of a successful design, is one that doesn't have a lot of stuff that could break. You could, of course, have an electric pump, to add pressure. And if you were on a larger property and you need to send it longer distances, that would certainly make sense. But the beauty is that on this scale, it's really not necessary. And you're saving all the use of your municipal water just by making use of a lot of infrastructure that already exists, namely the roof line here, right? So I think it really highlights that practicality. Just to wrap up here, I kind of want to go into a little example we had talked about. When you have about a 30 millimeter rain event, you said that it was like 6,600 some liters you get off your roof. And does that include the back sheds, or is that just the house?
That's just the house. That doesn't include the sunroom or the sheds.
Wow. So that's a lot of water.
And take
Yeah.
that and divide it by 4, and that's approximately what's coming down each downspout. And then think about the fact that a rain barrel that we get from the hardware store holds 200 liters.
Right.
But there's like much more than that coming
Yeah,
down each
a
downspout.
good perspective for someone at home to think about that size of a rain barrel.
Yeah.
It's a lot of water.
And so even these large tanks, having 2 of them, a very moderate rain event like that, especially if you have a few of those over the course of 1 week, the tank's already full from the first one.
Yeah.
So where are you going to store all that water? Well, we can store many thousands of liters of water down in here.
Right, in this ecosystem sponge with the sunken pathways. That makes me think, just to kind of broaden the conversation into the bigger environmental picture. One of the things that's interesting about making use of a natural resource is that it becomes something that is a resource for you to use. Whereas if you weren't capturing it here and using it and creating this sponge and watering your plants, it's actually pollution. Because in our urban areas and in our rural areas, excessive water that runs off land causes erosion, causes siltation, which destroys habitat for aquatic species. In an urban area, it's washing through the roads and picking up pollutants off the road, which are going into our river systems. So it's so cool to see that not only are you growing a food forest, are you growing ground covers, are you growing a garden, you're also reducing your footprint. And not just because you're reducing your actual water use, but you're reducing your footprint from the actual impact of your property losing its water into that urban environment.
And it's taking less time and energy on our part to maintain that system.
So you get to sit back and eat your food and watch the water flow.
Right?
Well, hey, it's been a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
See you in the next one. All right, I'll let you go. That was fun.